Hello Year 9s and welcome to this summary video about the work that you've done so far on ecosystems. The first lesson that you were to do was to look at what an ecosystem actually is and hopefully to be able to use some keywords to do with ecosystems. As this is all about ecosystems, you hopefully should be able to hear some birds singing in the background, which is nice, isn't it? So, what is an ecosystem first of all? It's something that includes living and non-living parts in a specific area, basically an ecosystem. And by living we mean things that are biotic, so the plants and the animals, and by non-living we mean things like the soil, the climate in the area. And it's the relationship between those two things that makes the ecosystem. It's very closely linked to things that you'll do in biology in GCSE, this topic, so you will have probably quite a good subject knowledge of it over the next 3 years. When we look at ecosystems, we have to break down the organisms that live in the ecosystem into 3 groups, which are producers, consumers and decomposers. Producers, what they do is that they use sunlight to make food for other things. So they're the plants in the ecosystem. So think of something like grass. A consumer is something in the ecosystem that survives and gets its energy by eating other organisms. So they might eat the producers, so a rabbit eats the grass, or they might eat other consumers, so a fox eats a rabbit. So both foxes and rabbits in the ecosystem are what we call consumers. And then we've got a decomposer. Now these are the things that break down the dead animals, the dead plants, leaves and things like that fall onto the floor. These are decomposers. And basically these are things like fungi and mushrooms and things like that that grow by breaking down the thing that they're growing on. What I wanted you to then think about is just examples of things like food webs in an ecosystem. So if you look on the slide at the moment, you've got a food web which starts off with the bushes and the berries. They're the producers in this ecosystem. And from those, you've then got these various different consumers. Ladybirds, the green fly eats the berries, the ladybird eats the green fly, the spider eats the green fly, and then the birds around these things eat these insects here as well. And at the top of this food web you've got the sparrowhawk, which will eat the sparrow and the thrush. Notice the sparrowhawk doesn't eat any of the producers in the first place. It eats other consumers, like the fox eating the rabbit on the other slide. Okay, now the next thing we needed to think about was things that could happen naturally or caused by humans that could affect the ecosystem. So for example, if you have a hot, dry summer, then if it's dry, the producer won't grow as much because it needs water as well as sunlight to grow. If it doesn't grow as much, there's going to be fewer berries on that hedgerow in the winter, and so therefore in the winter the number of things like thrushes and sparrows won't be able to survive on that ecosystem as much because it's got a lack of food for the birds, and therefore it's going to have a knock-on effect with the other consumers in the food chain like the sparrowhawks, because they've got no smaller birds to try and kill to eat. Sometimes humans can affect these ecosystems as well. So if humans trim the hedgerow, then there's less of a habitat for ladybirds, greenfly and spiders, so their numbers will fall, and therefore the birds that eat them, again the sparrows and the thrushes, have got nothing to eat, and therefore the sparrowhawks have got nothing to eat. So the situation continues. Another thing that you have to think about with ecosystems is something called nutrient recycling, and this is where nutrients get recycled around an ecosystem. So what we've got, if you think about this as this diagram here, what you've got here is a leaf falling off a tree. I don't know what the music's doing now, just ignore that. as a leaf falls off a tree, rain falls onto it, and it starts to become a bit mouldy and a bit rotten, and then decomposition can happen. So mushrooms and fungi break down those leaves, and then what they do is they release the... I'm going to have to try and get rid of this music. Hang on. Thank you for that. So the nutrients from the dead leaves get released into the soil, and then plants absorb those nutrients from the soil, which allows the plant or the tree, whatever plant it might be, to grow bigger, and then the leaves fall off the plant and the whole thing goes around again, and we call this nutrient recycling. Now, ecosystems has got the word system in them, which means it has an input and an output, and it's a system, so it circulates around and around. And so if you think about an ecosystem, the inputs into this are rainfall, the sunlight obviously that helps things grow in the first place, and then the outputs are things like surface runoff. So the rainfall that interacts with the leaves on the floor then runs off, goes into the nearest water system, and that's an output of the ecosystem. Right, moving on. Now we're going to look at the main ecosystems of the world. We'll not go into too much detail about them. Some of them you'll be very familiar with, some of them you'll be less familiar with. If we start with tundra at the top here, this is one you'll probably be less familiar with. Tundra is basically in the northern areas of places like Canada and Russia, Lapland, and many parts of Greenland as well. You do get some plants growing there. You get a lot of things like mosses and grasses that grow there, because we've got a layer of frozen ground called a permafrost. And a permafrost is very, very cold. It's permanently frosty, so which means it's cold all year, and therefore not a lot of things will grow on there. So it's more things like grasses and mosses in those areas. If we go around clockwise, we've then got grasslands, and they're these yellow areas on the map. Now, grasslands, if you think about the film Madagascar, that's the kind of ecosystem you're looking at there. Lots of grasses grow in very warm climates usually, but then you do get colder grasslands as well. So your savanna grasslands are found around the tropics, and your temperate grasslands are found in slightly colder areas like this. You've then got your temperate deciduous forest. That's our ecosystem where we live in the UK. So 4 seasons of the year, trees lose their leaves, nutrient cycle, and everything related to that. We've then got polar ecosystems, which is like the North and the South Pole. Antarctica as a continent is all polar. So very, very little growing of anything. And obviously the kind of animals you can expect to find there: polar bears, penguins. Then we move on to hot deserts. Hot deserts are found in this band between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Along those areas there is where you're going to find your hot deserts there, your high pressure areas, which gives them that hot, dry climate all year round. We'll look at hot deserts in more detail later on throughout the topic. And then we've got our tropical rainforest, which is another one that we're going to focus on in this topic. And tropical rainforests are found within the tropics along the equator. And they're noted for their hot, wet temperatures all year round, no seasons, rains every day. Okay, so moving on to tropical rainforests, the key thing that we need to know about is the features of the tropical rainforest ecosystem. They're studied a lot because they're probably the most amazing ecosystem in the world due to the amount of plants and animals that live within them. So just linking to what we've just looked at, this is where the tropical rainforests are, and if an exam question asks to describe the location, you need to try and use the T method. So trend, example, and then if there's any anomalies on there. So the general trend for tropical rainforests is that they grow or they exist around the equator within the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. For example, and the one that we're going to study is the Amazon rainforest, which is this one here. And then looking for any kind of anomaly, there's none that really fall outside of the tropics. So your anomaly could be there seems to be a large cluster of them around Southeast Asia, and that could be your anomaly there. Key features of them: the climate is hot and wet all year round. Temperature wise, it's 20 to 28 degrees. The sun, because of the location of where these are, the sun is directly overhead during the daytime, so it creates a lot of evaporation from the water in the area. That water rises up, and towards the end of the day you then get your rainfall, and the rainfall is very high, 2,000 millimeters per year, and it rains every day. So it creates that very hot and humid environment, different from a desert, not as hot as a desert and much wetter than a desert. Because of that rainfall, the soil isn't very fertile. It gets the nutrients in the soil from decaying plants and things like that gets washed away every single day. So there's only a very thin layer of nutrients on the soil. So the plants in the tropical rainforest don't necessarily just rely on the soil for their growth, they rely on other things as well. Plants are generally evergreen, so they don't have seasons there, so they don't have a time of the year when all the leaves fall off and a time of the year where everything starts to grow again. It's evergreen, so it continually grows throughout the whole season. Many of the plants are really tall. The trees in the tropical rainforest grow really tall because they're fighting against each other to get the sunlight, because remember, they can't rely on the nutrients from the soil for the growth, so they rely on sunlight more. Lots of things like epiphytes in the tropical rainforest, so plants that live on other plants to exist, so things like orchids and ferns. So big trees may have orchids growing on them, and a lot of them have ferns growing out of the bottoms of them as well. People in the rainforest are generally indigenous people, which means they live a tribal lifestyle. Some people in the Amazon rainforest have never seen any other community of people other than the tribe and their neighbouring tribe, so very, very remote. And then the animals of the rainforest are a very broad amount of different species within the rainforest. So, and we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Okay, biodiversity. Rainforests are very, very biodiverse, and that means that they've got a huge variety of both plants and animals. So the biology of the rainforest is diverse. That's what that means. They contain 50% of the world's plant and animal and insect species, and half of all life on Earth exists in the rainforest. And if you think back to the map that we looked at a bit ago, the rainforests were the dark green areas, and the dark green areas did not make up 50% of the world's surface area, the Earth's surface, but they contain 50% of the plants and the animals there, which just shows how biodiverse they are. Lots of organisms have evolved, and they depend on other species in there, and they've evolved to be able to adapt to the climate of the rainforest, that hot, wet climate. But the trouble is we've got things like deforestation occurring there, and that is going to have a big impact on the biodiversity of the rainforest. And if we bear in mind that 50% of the world's plant and animal species live there, we get a lot of things like medicines from plants from the rainforest, potentially the treatments for big diseases that we get in our country, potentially things like COVID-19. There could be a cure for something like that, or a treatment for something like that from a rainforest plant. Leukemia is controlled by rainforest plants or ingredients that we've extracted from rainforest plants. So if we chop them down, we're potentially losing the chance to find cures for diseases. Now, we've looked at biodiversity already. If we look at adaptation, so we've got a leaf here, and if you remember, we get 2,000 millimeters of rainfall a year in a tropical rainforest. That's 2 meters worth of rain in every area. So if that rain fell on the leaves of plants in this country, the leaves wouldn't survive. And the leaves are like a little solar panel for a plant. Without the leaves, the plant can't absorb that sunlight, the plant will die. So the leaves have got to be very, very adaptable to this climate. And the way that they do that is that they have a waxy surface that allows the raindrops to not be absorbed in and to not damage the leaf. And then when it gets really warm again and hot and the sunlight, the waxy surface manages to to not shrivel up with the sunlight. But they also have these drip tips at the end that allows the rainwater to roll off without damaging the leaf onto the floor below. Other things that other adaptations that the rainforest has got is that the plants grow in 4 layers like this in this structure. Remember we talked about the plants being very, very tall. Well, that's the canopy layer of the rainforest. The general layer of the rainforest is these very, very tall trees, but poking out of the top of those, when there's space that allows a tree to rise up much higher, you get emergent trees like this, and these can grow up to 30 metres high. Underneath the canopy, it's very, very dark, so you've got what we call an understory. And the understory is very kind of shrubby plants. Because there's limited sunlight, you don't get your normal kind of trees, you get more shrub kind of plants. And then right at the bottom, where it's really dark, really humid, you get the ground layer. And that's mostly made up of decomposed material, fungi, rotting tree trunks, rotting leaves, etc. Okay, so plant adaptations. Trees grow really tall. The trees have got something called buttress roots, which are basically roots that spread out on the surface of the earth instead of going deep underground. And those buttress roots allow those tall trees to stand up very tall and firmly, but also because the nutrients aren't deep down in the earth, they're on the surface. The buttress roots allow the tree to absorb as many nutrients as it can before the rain washes them away. Leaves are thick and waxy. Plants drop the leaves gradually throughout the year so they can grow all year round. 4 layers of trees, as we've discussed. Lianas or vines climb up other plants to reach for sunlight. They're the things that Tarzan swings on. The leaves have drip tips so rainwater can fall off them. And when one tree falls, another tree will grow and replace it very, very quickly. And that's usually within a year of the first tree falling. Animals have adapted too. So sloths, they're nocturnal. They're awake at night when it's cooler so they can conserve energy. They don't move around much because they don't have a lot of energy. Howler monkeys, they live high up in the rainforest. They never touch the floor of the rainforest and therefore they avoid all the predators at the bottom. Anteaters have got a really strong sense of smell. They can't really climb trees, so they live on the forest floor where it's really dark, and in order to find the ants and things that they want to eat, they rely on their sense of smell with that long nose to try and eat the ants that they need to survive. Geckos camouflage, they blend in with the leaves, and jaguars swim so they can cross a lot of the rivers in the rainforest because rainforests rain every day, so there's lots of rivers there. So if a jaguar is going to survive, it can't just stay in one area, it's got to be able to move around so they can swim. And animals like flying squirrels, it'd be dangerous for them to touch the forest floor because of the predators there like the jaguars, so they need to stay up in the trees, and so they've developed these flaps of skin between the legs, which act as wings so they can jump from tree to tree in order to get the food that they need. This is a picture of a buttress root there. You can just see how tall a very handsome 6'2" young man there can stand within the roots of a buttress tree. And there's some ex-students there stood next to them as well. You can see the lianas or the vines there trying to grow up to get the sunlight. And how the scale of those trees. Final thing we're going to look at in our little summary is deforestation, and what we need to be able to understand is the cause of deforestation and the impact that deforestation might have. So first of all, why is deforestation? Why does it exist? What's the situation that is making deforestation occur? And we've got things like population pressure. So the more that, if you think about rainforests, they often exist around the equator, and the countries around the equator are generally either lower income countries or newly emerging economies. So they've got rapidly growing populations. They're countries that are trying to develop very, very quickly. And so when there's cities in those countries become too full and too big, then they will start to use land in the rainforest around them for population. So they'll clear land for new settlements. As the countries try to become richer, they will extract any raw materials that they've got. So mineral extraction is a huge cause. Energy development, there's strong, fast-flowing rivers in tropical rainforests, so it's a good source of hydroelectric power, which could then provide electricity for the developing country where it's located. Commercial logging, the trees are very valuable, and so people want to use them for furniture, so lots of trees get cut down for that. This is a really big one at the moment. Palm oil is a huge cause of deforestation, where the original trees are cut down and in their place palm oil trees or palm trees like this are planted, and that palm oil is used in so many different foods and household products that we all have palm oil in our houses linked to these trees in the rainforest. Now the trouble is with that is an orangutan, for example, would not be able to survive in that tree. It can't live there and it can't hunt for its food there. It needs its normal rainforest trees and it won't be able to survive there. So they get pushed out and then they get captured and used as pets or sold to countries like China or the Middle East as pets, or they just get killed. And then finally you've got subsistence farming. Of all the types of farming, this is the nicest one, because subsistence farming is where farmers just grow food for themselves. They're not mass producing palm oil or anything like that. They're just growing enough food for themselves to survive, so it doesn't involve too much deforestation. Now, deforestation has lots of impacts, and we break the impacts into three: social, environmental and economic. Socially, it focuses on the tribes. They're often forced out of the villages and they're forced to work for the new industries that locate there. If they don't agree to work for them, then they get treated badly, they get pushed out, and then they therefore end up either just working for those people or trying to survive somewhere else. And the life expectancy of these tribal people isn't very long in those circumstances. Environmental impacts are all very negative. So the lack of trees means that there's no soil. The soil's not held together, whatever that's supposed to be there. Heavy rain will wash that soil away, so we'll get massive amounts of soil erosion in the rainforests, and that will then contaminate the rivers with soil, so the rivers will become a lot more brown looking, and therefore the fish in the rivers won't be able to survive. When you burn trees, it releases CO2, and trees themselves absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So linking back to our last topic on climate change, less trees means that less CO2 can be absorbed, so global warming will increase. And the more nutrients that get washed away, the less fertile the land is, so the less useful the land is. So anyone trying to farm that land in the first place won't be able to, because it's not nutritious enough. We've then got the economic impacts. So the negatives, first of all, the resources that have been extracted will eventually run out. They're finite resources, so these companies will go out of business. So they'll go into the rainforest, they'll destroy a large area of the rainforest for a certain period of time, then they'll run out of money and then they'll leave it. It won't be put back to how it was. The company can't afford to do that. Remember, these are in developing countries. Mass deforestation destroys the livelihoods of people who work in the rainforest already and live in the rainforest already. So tribal people have got their own little industries that they use there, like rubber tapping and collecting, food from the rainforest for themselves to eat. So their own livelihoods are destroyed by it. Tourists like to go and visit rainforests, and if the rainforest, is chopped down, then tourists won't be able to want to visit that rainforest. So any businesses set up to cater for tourism will then be destroyed as well, and we'll get that negative multiplier effect that we sometimes talk about. On the positive side, though, for the economy, logging, mining and large-scale farming does create jobs for the countries, and it will boost the local economy. Not in the long term, usually in the short term. Also, selling good quality timber and minerals can bring in money for the countries. So again, it will raise the GDP of those countries, but generally not in a sustainable way. Now, the rate of deforestation is there's lots of different figures about this on the internet. There's some figures that talk about, the size of a football pitch will be lost every 2 seconds, and there's no definitive number on this. But if we go with what our revision guide says, rate of deforestation is very high. It's about 300,000 kilometres per squared per year between 2000 and 2010. So every year, 300,000 kilometres squared is being, cut down. There are hotspots for this. So Nigeria, which you'll study in year 10 for urbanisation, is a hotspot for deforestation. And Borneo, which is this island here, which belongs partly to Indonesia and partly to a little bit to Malaysia as well, is under huge pressure with deforestation. Madagascar's another one, and if you look at the island of Borneo here, you can see from 1950 where it was pretty much all forested, and it's down to about 50% forest by 2020. And this is where orangutans live. This is their natural habitat. So orangutan numbers have fallen dramatically because of that. You can see in Brazil, deforestation, where the Amazon rainforest is, or where most of the Amazon is kind of fluctuating over the years. So sometimes it's really high and sometimes it's really low. And Brazil are one of the countries desperately trying to reduce deforestation. But obviously it's a developing country, a newly emerging economy, so it can't just stop deforestation.